for joining, and thank you, Tig, for this week's Coffee Talk. Just to introduce you to Tig McIntyre, who will give this week's Coffee Talk on thinking local in GoGreenRoutes, big data in medium-sized cities. So thanks, Tig. I'll hand it over to yourself.
Yeah, look, thanks for being here. This is a brief overview, so I will try to get into the story. So I hope there's some congruence between the title and what you're going to see now. I tried, but limited time, but let's see what ideas this might provoke for you. This should click on. Okay, so I'm an environmental psychologist. The word environmental is in inverted commas because we're not quite sure what that is. I don't have a master's in environmental psychology. I'm actually an accredited sport and exercise psychologist and a practitioner in that area for a number of years who went into health and then went into urban health. And when I applied for a job in Maynooth, they said, what is environmental psychology? And honestly, I had to Google it. Just don't tell my bosses that. So I coordinate, I'm the scientific coordinator and occasionally manager, depends on the availability for other staff for Horizon 2020 funded project GoGreenRoutes. It's a 4-year project promoting urban health. You'll hear more about that in a moment. I also coordinate a master's, so it's basically hired to run a master's in environmental psychology at the Department of Psychology at Maynooth. And that's pretty small in scale at the moment, but it is growing. And it actually runs across different departments. So we have input from, for example, Department of Geography, Department of Biology, and other departments. I would highlight I'm not an expert. Like I might have a H index, which is okay, but I'm an experienced researcher and practitioner. And that's probably my strength, because I would pose that in some of the complex areas we're dealing with here about urban health, nobody's truly an expert because it's just too complicated. So perhaps expertise is something that only occurs when you create a shared mandate across a group of people who are experienced. I'll just step forward and highlight that my kids always say I'm interested in trees. My phone number has about 5 trees in it. And, I do have an interest in nature, and that's not from an ecology background. So I would have done, outdoor sport quite a bit. And I certainly have a bit of gained an understanding into a couple of areas. So they're probably not so much around ecology, but more about air pollution. And that's just as a result of working with colleagues on other parts of our project. So this is a map of our project. So essentially there's 6 target cities, some links with Beijing. That's pretty hard to quantify what we're going to be able to do right now. That's certainly shifted politically from where it was in the beginning. We have partners across the European sites and the green cities, the green countries are the ones we target. So Limerick, the municipality of Versailles, Burgas in Bulgaria, really interesting city. It was a shrinking city and now it's growing because of the war in Ukraine. The population actually went up by about 20% in Burgas, but that depends because they'll have to move them out during the tourist season, which is it's a Black Sea city. You've got Umeå in Sweden, which is a really leading city in terms of gendered interventions, and that's something that's quite important to us in our project. Is a kind of inclusivity and intersectionality dimension. We work with Lahti and Tallinn, who both won Green Capital Awards. So that's a big deal in terms of a city's identity, in terms of the European context. There's different initiatives. You've probably heard of 100 Climate Neutral and Smart City Initiative, which is more recent. There's European Green Capital Awards and the Green City Accord. So 2 of our cities, honestly, they probably hit a ceiling effect in some ways by already winning these awards. We're in innovation action, so we are not primarily driven by research, but we have had outputs published in Lancet about 2 weeks ago, in Lancet Planetary Health last year, and we've a health impact assessment, an RCT and physical activity, and a cost benefit analysis to come, along with a lot of other implementation science. So it's a large scale project and it's really super busy. We're in our 3rd year, which is pretty much like any band's 3rd album. Like it's the most challenging time, but we're definitely getting through it. Just to give a I guess, a little bit more detail into our approach, right? So there's ways of looking at cities which have changed radically in the last 20 years. I think everybody could agree with that. And there's definitely been a paradigm shift. And part of that is to analyze, like, what do we mean by a paradigm shift? What's a different lens or way of looking at a problem? And I came across something interesting that kind of fits with our line of thinking. So there's a recent analysis of citations to look at, how important is disruptive science? Because disruptive science is what leads to paradigm shifts, not iterative science. And the analysis used this index called the CD index. And from this analysis of many thousands of cited manuscripts, they were able to come up and look at a trend. And they said that there was a decline in disruptive science or outputs from disruptive science by more than 90% between 1945 and 2010. So this is kind of what it looks like. Hopefully it'll appear. So this is either that we've got really good iterative science paradigm and established paradigms which are without debate, but it also is given the complexity of what we're dealing with, we'll come back to that, we probably do need some disruptive science. So in our project, we attempt to live up to a little bit these ambitions, and it's very challenging. Like if you think of work packages and the people in a work package, if they're all from the one, field of training, for example, environmental psychology or even epidemiology, they're going to apply their typical paradigm. And what we do in GoGreenRoutes, we struggle, but we do try that. We try to develop new paradigms where we can and new ways of looking at some of the issues so we can be more disruptive. Because we're actually only one of 3 European projects that are totally focused on urban health from this perspective that we call the nature-based solutions perspective. So we think we're somewhat unique, and we'll know more by the end of our project. But ultimately, we are looking at what are called wicked problems. So this idea came from 1967 from a conference, and then more belatedly, a 1973 paper. So a lot of you would be familiar with that concept of what is a wicked problem. But let's just put it this way. These are not entirely unrelated. Climate change, and notice the language, we're not talking about climate chaos or catastrophe, biodiversity loss, physical inactivity. We could talk about sedentary behavior in NCDs, like type 2 diabetes, but we try to use terms which, if you use a phrase as a psychologist, which empowers people rather than scares them, you've probably got a better chance to find a solution. What we call urban pollution, so typically we're referring to the co-hazards of noise and air pollution. And potentially there are shared solutions here. So there's solutions you can apply which actually address all of these simultaneously to different degrees. And if you look at the timing of those solutions, if it's a nature-based solution like regreening a city, that can take time. So it could take years for example, the nature to mature. And I'll just try and move on and just take you one step further, but I think a lot of us would agree that it's time for change. I'll give you one example. So I was at an All-Ireland forum relating to biodiversity and climate change recently, and there were 70 people ballpark in the room. My estimate could be wrong, and only 2 people mentioned health. And I was really disturbed that people weren't able to see that there's a link between climate change and biodiversity and human health. And the way I look at that is in terms of who's going to fund the problem. If the problem is a biodiversity issue, it could be parks and wildlife, it could be different government agencies, but certainly the health budget is, one of the thickest budgets or the most largest budgets we have in our economy. So if it's a health budget piece and it reduces the health budget, well, then you're actually talking to perhaps people with a lot of change in their pockets. So if you make a saving in health, it has huge implications. Similarly, if you go to what we call environmental justice, if this is more related to human rights and social issues, well, then you access a whole other stream of funding. And there's a discussion at the moment, and we were in meetings in Norway with the World Bank, where they were looking at what are the mechanisms by which they can finance nature-based interventions, nature-based solutions. So definitely, we would suggest it is a time for change. So where does this take us to? I'm just going to give you an idea of some of the work we've done. So just the context is a paper by the WHO on urban health suggested that, I'll translate this. So you should be able to walk 5 minutes from your residence and access half a football pitch. And that's, a significant health determinant, as you'll see in a moment. But there's an SDG target 11.7, which essentially says having access to green space is really important for everybody, a very inclusive target. Now, what happened in our study, and I'm only going to highlight one of them, is we did an analysis of 1,000 cities, and we estimated 43,000 lives in Europe could be saved if this recommendation was met. And less than approximately 2/3 of Europeans didn't have this minimum access to green space. So the World Economic Foundation featured this in a video not so long ago about green space in city. And the issue here is not just access to green space, because that could be like an Irish park, which is often just a monoculture, but actually the quality of that green space. And that's something we address further in our project. I'm going to go quickly through a couple of slides just to give you a highlight here. But essentially, we wrote a book in 2019. We looked at nature-based interventions. And that's like using nature as a means to promote mental health, to reduce disease, particularly NCDs and non-communicable diseases. And what this highlights is, you need to connect different aspects here. So as I mentioned, biodiversity, climate, green space, and health. So we created a model of multidimensional health. There are others. One is known as planetary health, and One Health is another. And these are very much enshrined in the most recent documents for the EU around Horizon Europe funding. So you're connecting like sleep, because better sleep with reduced noise pollution. You're connecting access to green space with physical activity and community health. You're connecting mental health and well-being with access to nature. And this is based on hard evidence, which you'll see hopefully now. So just to highlight that, one of the, sorry. I will get there.
What's happening there?
Let me try.
Just close it there on the top right there, that window type. Just yeah. Oh.
That one over there?
Yeah, okay there. Yeah.
Okay.
So roll it mouse, I think.
Okay. Do you want to try? I might try the next one. All right. Okay, have a quick go. Okay, so sorry about that. I'll try and continue the narrative. So we look at two things. NBIs are the kind of interventions to build around this. And nature-based solutions are essentially the regreening of cities, is a good example. So the alternative to a green solution is a great solution. So for flood risk, this might be putting in additional plants and flooding areas with green space close to the water, or putting in walls to stop flooding. And the green solutions turn out often to be more efficient and have multiple benefits. So in our study, we applied both in GoGreenRoutes, we use both NBI and NBS. We measure benefits and adverse consequences. So the benefits are for health. The additional benefits are for the environment, the co-benefits of the environment, and the additional benefits are for sustainability, but we also have to monitor adverse consequences. So, even simply a walk in the park, right? Access to nature for physical activity, even though there's some only tentative support for this from meta-analysis by one of my colleagues in the UK, there is, emerging evidence suggests that there are major health benefits. And part of this could be, for example, the reduced carbon footprint of walking outdoors as opposed to driving to a gym and thinking about all the grey infrastructure and resources that are required for gym-based activity. This is just one model of all the potential benefits of nature-based interventions, but we also include things like increased exposure to pollution. And I'll try to finish really quickly because we have something called the Hyde Park phenomenon. So if you go to Hyde Park, you put yourself at risk if you have asthma or COPD. So there's adverse consequences for many groups if they go to green space. So it's not going to green space, it's about getting people to high quality green space. In our study, we try to overcome the typical paradigm to look at green space and urban green areas, and which focus, like green space is just one thing, which I'll come to, but the second is we look at the co-hazard noise and air pollution. But there's actually, thermal comfort, there's rich biodiversity, there's a natural soundscape, which is easily recognized by avian species. And there's reviews like that by Earth, which is in BMJ, which support these other positive factors. So we're creating an index which cities could use to show that they have both positive and negative features in their urban environment. And this could, mean that you might have a score for a particular park. And that could be really useful, because if it's based on dynamic measurement, you could say based on the temperature, based on the wind, based on the air pollution and traffic that day, one park you might recommend people avoid, another park you might recommend people go to. So this index assesses positive and negative factors about green space. There's another piece is people have a long history of interacting with nature, whether it's from their holidays or whether it's from going to their local park or playing in their own backyard or gardens. And it's actually your connection or perceived relationship with nature is linked to psychological well-being. And we're working on that. It's work by one of our researchers, Cassie Murphy at Maynooth University. So we're particularly focused not on access or relationship with wilderness areas, but what about people's connection to urban nature? Because that's the nature that most of us get to access. So one question is, do we have to access, nature, or can we use a digital alternative? And this is from work we're doing with one of my co-affiliations, which is INN in Norway. And essentially they use OpenStreetMaps to generate this, and then they added in nature. And what it shows you is essentially we can use this to connect people to nature, to reconnect them, but also to create future scenarios. You could generate future scenarios for what would you like your city to look like. That's particularly important in terms of EU restoration law, a lot of policy direction around biodiversity in cities. We have a version of this, which is gamification, whereby you chase a butterfly and you can't catch butterfly, because if you catch the butterfly, it would require such high resolution that the computer would probably melt if we do that. But this is interesting. We've pilot tested this in a number of cities and towns. And actually, when you use this as a promotional tool, we call it a showcase for the project work, it's actually quite well received. Okay, so digital nature is interesting, but it's not the same thing. And the question we often get asked is, would you like, your mother, if they were in a care home, to only access digital nature? Now, that's pretty harsh. So we don't advocate this. In fact, we think that non-digital or authentic nature is hypothesized stronger effects. Then you've got virtual nature, and then you've got digital nature, something you might view on your phone. So that we've written a number of papers and have one in the pipeline at the moment, which show there are risks to this. But we're looking at how we can use digital nature as a tool to connect people to their local nature. I think I'm almost finished, so let me just move on, and I'll finish with a story, but we have other data sources. So I didn't want to go through it because it's not my work, but we have social sentiment analysis from Twitter, and that's actually a little bit risky at the moment, as you can imagine. But we have campaigns which are designed to promote nature-based activity in each of the 6 cities. And then we analyze the Twitter responses, because we've access still at the moment to that data. And then from that, we can see that different areas will generate different emotional responses. And this is based on the work by members of the team, Daniel Quercia and Rossano Schifanella, who was called Happy Maps for Cities. We have a HIA, or Health Impact Assessment, and other analyses to be conducted. They actually, interestingly, the Health Impact Assessment combines qual and quant data, and we're about to go conduct the baseline data on that in the 6 cities. We look at a model of converging evidence. We're trying to get data from multiple sources as possible, from walking interviews to survey data to environmental quality data. And really, we're interested in exploring these interactions between nature, health, and urban living. But just before I give you my finished my final line, I just highlight that, at the beginning of our project, we work out, okay, 10 million, 1 million citizens. If you gave them, this is not, don't tell my funding agency about this, but we worked out, if you gave them chocolate, wine, or say weed, 10 spotted weed, like whatever we do in a project has to have a bigger impact than any of those, potential 10 euros worth of interventions. So that's probably our start point. So, that's not setting the bar too high, but it tells you, we actually work for, this is, we work for people in the city. So our job is to ensure we have a significant impact on their lives in those 6 cities. And finally, never underestimate complexity of phenomenon. And that's really tells something about running a project, but also something about what we're looking at. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks very much, Ty. Very interesting. I think we'll open the floor now and the people online for any questions. I just take them when you're ready. Go.
Turn it off.
I have a question. You know, you in your slide you were saying there was 43K number of people that you sort of, how do you quantify that figure in terms of the lives that you would be saving that you?
Yeah, so it's estimated based on reduced exposure to air pollution.
Mhm.
And so there's two models applied, and the other is increased physical activity by having access to green space based on some other data. Now, there's a really interesting other study, which I didn't show, which is if we say that's a rule, you know, that it's useful to have green space access. The second rule they tested, and I wasn't part of this one, was it's very hard for an Irish person to say, it's the 3-30-300 rule. So can you see three trees from your house? Do you have 30% canopy cover in your city? And are you within 300 meters of, you know, the half football pitch? And when they did that in Barcelona, which is a high density city with not very much green space, only 5% of their residents actually met that criteria. But for them, there was significant mental health benefits for some of those criteria, not the trees from your window. But that canopy cover one is interesting because, you know, that mitigates air pollution and noise pollution, has many beneficial effects, mitigating some urban heat island effects as well. But one of the issues about that is, for sure, that has to be tested again. And we need to have rules which aren't just simply about green space access, but include, you know, attachment or people's connectivity to the green space and account for biodiversity. So we do need these type of rules to test. But we need them to be a little bit more complex. And even on the 30% canopy cover, that rules out pretty much all Irish and British cities. So we definitely do poorly on that criteria. Nordic and Scandinavian cities would align with that. But it tells us that we straight away, by the structure in terms of nature in our cities, we predispose ourselves to risks in terms of air pollution, for a start.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very important also this approach to holistic health and well-being, and you were showing the multidimensional health model. Maybe we can talk also about that. I'm very interested. Would like to understand two things. One is if you can measure somehow the impact, for example, the exposure of people with nature, and as a direct impact on the health, and you can measure, and also you relate, because you are using this holistic kind of a model where you consider different dimensions of health,
yeah.
And so that everything is kind of interacting with everything else, yes. So that of course it's also difficult to single out a single aspect and to measure. So how can you measure the impact of any intervention of exposure of people with nature or whatever, and how it's related to the other aspects?
Yeah, so we have specific interventions which are, which are essentially putting like a greenway into Limerick, right? And we have we gather baseline and follow-up data on that, and we look at environmental factors and mood and health and well-being indices. And then we do an area of similar SES within Limerick as a control, and we compare that in terms of a similar cohort. So we have a way to test it, but it's only on the small scale. For example, that's actually one of our largest interventions, and it's an 830-meter greenway. And it's really cool because it connects people to a local school, but it's not hugely impactful in terms of air quality, except perhaps outside the school, because we've reduced the vehicular traffic there, right? The question you ask is really interesting, because actually in our next collaboration called GoGreenRoutes, which we're working on, we use an app from an American software company, which gives you time in nature. It also has an estimate of 180 minutes as the target. So it's like the 10,000 steps. The golden rule here is 180 minutes of nature. And it gives you a nature score for how, not just if you reach that criteria, but, for where you live in terms of green space, quality, and accounting for the potential of pollutants in the area, like noise and air pollution. So we tried to partner with them on a more recent project, and they weren't getting direct to EU funding, but the next call we're involved in, they do. And I think in this study, we're really actually trying to test some other methods to support that. Like if you find out that people of a certain social class or from diverse backgrounds are disconnected with nature, well, then we know there are ways to promote that. So we create a micro intervention to promote nature amongst that group, and that might get them to the green space more. So the other bit is we're actually testing our multidimensional health model through the timeline of our project. Somebody asked me yesterday in class that says, is it published? I'm like, no, not yet, because the only thing we'll publish really would be a protocol and say, okay, here's the way we're going to test the interaction between these, I think you might call them interrelated factors. But in some cases, we're able to pair them. And I'll give you an example. So in our baseline, we do analysis of the environment from Copernicus. We do person-centered analysis of air quality. We do walking interviews. We do surveys. So we actually try piggyback a lot of different methodologies. And thank God I'm not doing the health impact assessment, because that is fairly complex data to deal with. I think the interesting thing is we are learning at each step what the potential problems and pathways are. So I think it'll probably be better able to answer that in about 18 months' time. Thanks for the question.
Have we time for one more?
Tyke, I'd be curious, just given that, you know, you mentioned maybe people there from like poor socioeconomic backgrounds and they tend to have like poor health outcomes. Is there any buy-in from the likes of like people on the ground, like your local authorities, like your housing departments, planning departments, to promote use of green spaces more so in the likes of social housing or in like new developments or things like that?
So that we have 6 cities, and it would depend on which the cities have different divisions within or departments. And in some cities are like you end up with like 8 different departments in a meeting, and others you end up with 2. But ultimately, part of our work is to establish, ensure that the cities by the end of the project have tools by which they can reach out and connect citizens to the nature in their area and develop or renature and add green infrastructure which meets the citizens' needs. So that means it's co-creation, not consultation. And also when looking for new cities for our next project, we now seek cities which have a really strong public participation network. And I'll give you one example. I looked at Cork today, and Cork have like 1,800 followers of their PPN. And I'm like, that is ideal, because in Limerick, we work with a very small team of people on the ground who we could consider part of what we call a local task force, but PPN. So we're hoping to ensure that we leave a policy legacy. And one of the things we're trying to do in Go Green is we're trying to get cities to sign up to the Green City Accord, to 100 climate neutral and smart city initiatives, because we need them to have a longer term ambition in this area. So it's not just meet their needs over the 4 years, try and ensure that we leave a legacy.
Brilliant, thanks a million, Tyke.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think we're just at 2 o'clock. So thank you again, Tyke, very much. That was really interesting. Next week, we'll continue the coffee talks next Thursday with Adrian McCann from Age Friendly Ireland and IVI. So thank you all very much for joining, and hopefully we'll talk again. And thank you, Tyke.